In the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky, where morning mist clings to ancient mountains like secrets refusing to be told, there exists a tale so disturbing that local authorities spent decades trying to bury it. What began as a routine wellness check in the autumn of 1987 would uncover one of the most shocking cases of genetic deterioration ever documented in modern America. The story I'm about to share with you challenges everything we think we know about isolation, family bonds, and the devastating consequences when bloodlines become too closely intertwined. This is not just another tale of rural poverty or neglect. This is the documented account of how one family's desperate attempt to preserve their legacy created a nightmare that would span 5 generations and leave investigators questioning the very limits of human survival. Before we dive into the depths of this case, I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear happened less than 40 years ago, in a country with modern medical facilities and child protection services. Yet somehow, an entire family managed to exist in complete isolation, practicing customs that would destroy them from within, all while remaining invisible to the outside world. The investigation that followed would reveal genetic conditions so rare that medical textbooks had to be rewritten. Children were born with deformities that doctors had never seen outside of theoretical studies. And at the center of it all was a family patriarch whose twisted interpretation of biblical teachings would condemn generations of his descendants to lives of unimaginable suffering. If you're drawn to cases that expose the hidden darkness lurking in forgotten corners of our society, then subscribe to this channel, because what we're about to explore together will challenge your understanding of how far human beings can fall when they're cut off from the normalizing influence of civilization. The Hartwell family established their homestead in the Cumberland Mountains in 1923, when Patriarch Jeremiah Hartwell purchased 847 acres of isolated mountain land for practically nothing. The property sat in a natural bowl surrounded by steep ridges, accessible only by a single dirt road that became impassable during winter months. To Jeremiah, this isolation wasn't a hardship. It was divine providence. Jeremiah had been expelled from 3 different Baptist congregations for his increasingly radical interpretations of Scripture. He believed that modern society was corrupting God's chosen people, and that only through complete separation could his family maintain their spiritual purity. But Jeremiah's definition of purity extended far beyond simple religious devotion. Drawing from selective readings of the Old Testament, Jeremiah became convinced that mixing family blood with outsiders would dilute the divine essence that God had placed within his lineage. He pointed to biblical passages about the chosen people and twisted them into a justification for what he called keeping the bloodline sacred. His wife Sarah, already pregnant with their 4th child when they moved to the mountains, had little choice but to accept her husband's increasingly controlling behavior. The first decade on the mountain seemed almost normal by rural Kentucky standards. Jeremiah and Sarah raised 6 children in a modest log cabin, growing their own food and living off the land. The children received basic education from their mother, learned practical skills from their father, and participated in daily Bible study that grew more intense with each passing year. But as the children reached adolescence, Jeremiah's true intentions became clear. When his eldest daughter Mary turned 16 in 1939, he announced that she would marry her brother Thomas, who was 18 at the time. Sarah's horrified protests were met with violent rage and twisted biblical justifications. Jeremiah had convinced himself that God had chosen his family as modern-day patriarchs and that keeping the bloodline pure was their sacred duty. The first forced marriage took place in a ceremony conducted by Jeremiah himself, who had declared himself a minister in his own religious sect. Thomas and Mary's first child was born in 1941, a son they named Joshua. The baby appeared normal at birth, giving Jeremiah what he saw as divine confirmation of his beliefs. But this would be the last normal birth in the Hartwell family. for the next 40 years. By 1945, 3 more incestuous marriages had been arranged among the siblings. The isolation of the mountain compound made resistance nearly impossible. The nearest neighbor lived 8 miles away, and the family made trips to town only twice per year for essential supplies. The children had been so thoroughly indoctrinated with Jeremiah's twisted theology that most truly believed they were fulfilling God's will. The second generation of children, born between 1941 and 1950, began showing the first signs of what medical experts would later identify as severe inbreeding depression. Joshua, despite appearing normal at birth, developed seizures by age 3 and showed signs of developmental delays that became more pronounced with each passing year. His younger siblings displayed an alarming array of physical abnormalities that Jeremiah dismissed as tests of faith. Rebecca, born in 1943, had 6 fingers on each hand and suffered from a cleft palate so severe she could barely speak. Her brother Samuel, born 2 years later, was blind in one eye and had a withered left arm. But perhaps most disturbing was little Ruth, born in 1947, whose facial features were so distorted that visitors to the compound would later describe her as barely recognizable as human. Rather than seeing these conditions as warning signs, Jeremiah interpreted them as evidence of his family's special relationship with God. He taught his followers that physical deformities were marks of divine favor, similar to the suffering of biblical figures. This twisted theology would prevent any of the family members from seeking medical help for their increasingly severe conditions. The third generation, born in the 1950s and 1960s, faced even more devastating genetic consequences. The coefficient of relatedness within the family had reached levels that geneticists would later describe as unprecedented in documented human populations. Children were being born to parents who were simultaneously siblings, cousins, aunt and nephew, and uncle and niece in various combinations. Medical records that would later be discovered show that the infant mortality rate within the compound reached 70% during this period. Most babies died within their first year of life, succumbing to conditions that could have been easily treated in any modern hospital. Those who survived often faced lives of constant physical pain and severe cognitive limitations. Daniel Hartwell, born in 1958, survived to adulthood despite being born with spina bifida, a severe heart defect, and what doctors would later identify as several rare genetic disorders that typically occur in less than 1 in a million births. His sister Elizabeth, born 3 years later, had no functioning kidneys and lived in constant agony until her death at age 12. The family had developed its own primitive medical practices, relying on herbal remedies and prayer rather than seeking outside help. Jeremiah had convinced his followers that doctors were agents of Satan, sent to corrupt God's chosen people with worldly medicine. This isolation from modern healthcare meant that conditions which could have been treated became death sentences. By the 1970s, the Hartwell compound housed 43 people across 4 generations, all descended from Jeremiah's original 6 children. The genetic diversity within the group had become so limited that DNA testing would later reveal that some individuals shared more than 80% of their genetic material, a level of similarity typically seen only in identical twins. The 4th generation, born during this decade, represented the most extreme example of inbreeding depression ever documented in a surviving human population. Children were born with combinations of genetic disorders that medical science had never seen before. Some had multiple limbs, others were born without basic organs, and many possessed cognitive abilities so limited they could not perform basic functions like feeding themselves. It was during this period that the compound's terrible secret nearly came to light for the first time, when a supply delivery driver reported seeing children with severe deformities playing in the yard. But Jeremiah had become increasingly paranoid about outside interference. and the family had developed elaborate systems for hiding their most severely affected members whenever strangers approached the property. The driver's report to local authorities resulted in a brief investigation, but Jeremiah's manipulation and the family's remote location allowed them to avoid scrutiny. The few officials who made it to the compound were shown only the least affected family members and were convinced that the reports had been exaggerated. This near discovery prompted Jeremiah to implement even stricter isolation protocols that would keep the family's horrifying reality hidden for another decade. As the 1980s dawned over the Cumberland Mountains, the Hartwell compound had become something that defied natural law. Jeremiah, now in his 70s and suffering from what appeared to be dementia, brought on by decades of isolation and possible genetic factors, had passed effective control to his son Thomas, who had inherited not only his father's leadership, but also his twisted interpretation of divine will. Thomas proved to be even more ruthless than his father in maintaining the family's isolation. Where Jeremiah had been motivated by religious delusion, Thomas seemed driven by a desperate understanding that exposure would mean the end of everything he had known. He had never lived outside the compound, never interacted with normal society, and had no frame of reference for how abnormal his family had become. Under Thomas's leadership, the compound developed increasingly sophisticated methods of concealment. Buildings were constructed in natural depressions to hide them from aerial view. Gardens were planted to look wild and abandoned from a distance. Most chillingly, Thomas established what he called the sanctuary, a series of underground chambers where the most severely affected family members were kept hidden from any potential outside observers. The sanctuary housed 17 individuals whose conditions were so extreme that even within the already horrifying context of the compound, they were considered too disturbing to be seen. These family members, ranging from infants to adults in their 20s, lived in perpetual darkness, cared for by rotating family members who brought food and provided basic hygiene care. Medical experts who would later examine the sanctuary described conditions that challenged their understanding of human survival. Some individuals had been born without the ability to process light, their eyes having never properly developed. Others had skeletal deformities so severe they could not support their own body weight. Several had neurological conditions that left them in states resembling persistent vegetative conditions, yet they somehow continued to live year after year. The psychological impact on the family members who served as caretakers was profound. Many developed what psychologists would later identify as severe dissociative disorders, mentally separating themselves from the reality of their daily existence. They created elaborate fantasy worlds and spoke in coded language that outside investigators would struggle to decipher for months. By 1985, the fifth generation was being born into conditions that represented the absolute limits of genetic viability. The gene pool had become so restricted that children were essentially clones of their parents, sharing genetic markers that should have been impossible in a naturally reproducing population. These children faced life expectancies measured in months rather than years. It was one of these fifth-generation births that would ultimately lead to the compound's discovery. In September 1987, a woman named Martha Hartwell, granddaughter of the original patriarch, gave birth to twins who were so severely malformed that even the family's primitive medical knowledge recognized they needed outside help. One twin had been born with its internal organs outside its body cavity, while the other appeared to have two heads sharing a single torso. Martha, driven by maternal instinct that overrode decades of indoctrination, made a desperate decision that would change everything. During a supply run to town, she approached Dr. James Morrison at the Cumberland County Medical Center and begged him to help her babies. Her appearance alone was shocking enough, her own genetic conditions apparent in her facial structure and physical development. But her description of the twins convinced Dr. Morrison that he was dealing with something unprecedented. Dr. Morrison's attempts to treat the twins led to questions about their parentage, their medical history, and their living conditions. Martha's answers became increasingly evasive and contradictory, raising red flags that prompted the doctor to contact social services. What began as a routine child welfare check would soon become one of the largest and most complex investigations in Kentucky's history. The social worker assigned to the case, Linda Patterson, had dealt with rural poverty and neglect countless times in her 15-year career. But nothing had prepared her for what she encountered when she finally located the Hartwell compound in October 1987. Her initial report, later obtained through Freedom of Information requests, described scenes that she claimed would haunt her for the rest of her life. Patterson's first glimpse of the compound revealed what appeared to be a normal, if somewhat primitive, rural homestead. But as she was led deeper into the property by Thomas Hartwell, who had reluctantly agreed to allow the inspection, the true horror began to reveal itself. Children emerged from buildings and hiding places, each displaying genetic abnormalities that became progressively more severe. The psychological manipulation that had kept the family isolated for decades was immediately apparent in Patterson's interactions with the residents. Many could barely communicate in recognizable English, having developed their own dialect over generations of isolation. Others seemed to exist in states of constant fear, cowering at the approach of an outsider and seeking protection from family members who were simultaneously their parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, and cousins in bewildering combinations. Patterson's report noted that establishing even basic facts about the family structure proved nearly impossible. Traditional concepts of family relationships had completely broken down, replaced by a complex web of interconnected bloodlines that defied conventional documentation. Children didn't know who their biological parents were because the adults themselves had lost track of the increasingly convoluted genetic connections. The investigation team that assembled in response to Patterson's report included medical specialists, geneticists, social workers, law enforcement officers, and mental health professionals. They faced challenges that none of them had encountered in their professional careers, dealing with a population that had essentially evolved in isolation for over 60 years. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a geneticist from the University of Kentucky, was among the first specialists to examine the family members. Her preliminary assessment revealed genetic diversity so limited that she initially questioned whether her testing equipment was functioning properly. The mathematical probability of the genetic combinations she was observing should have made reproduction impossible. Yet somehow the family had continued to produce offspring generation after generation. The medical examinations revealed conditions that existed nowhere else in scientific literature. Some family members displayed symptoms of genetic disorders that had never been documented in living patients, while others had developed entirely new syndromes resulting from unique combinations of recessive genes. The data collected from the Hartwell family would eventually contribute to dozens of research papers and fundamentally change scientists' understanding of human genetic limitations. The complexity of documenting the family's medical conditions was compounded by their complete lack of official records, birth certificates, medical histories, and even basic identifying information simply didn't exist. Many family members had never been given formal names, instead being referred to by descriptive terms or biblical references that changed depending on who was speaking. The investigation team found themselves creating an entirely new system of identification just to track which individuals they had examined. What made the situation even more disturbing was the discovery that not all family members were willing victims of their circumstances. As investigators gained the trust of some residents, they uncovered evidence of a rigid hierarchy that maintained control through a combination of religious indoctrination, physical intimidation, and deliberate isolation of potential dissidents. Several family members had attempted to leave over the years, only to be forcibly returned and subjected to what survivors described as religious punishment rituals. The compound's economic structure revealed another layer of exploitation that had helped maintain the family's isolation. Thomas Hartwell had established a network of contacts in nearby communities who purchased handmade crafts and agricultural products without asking questions about their origin. This income stream provided just enough resources to keep the family surviving while maintaining their separation from mainstream society. More troubling was the discovery that some outsiders had known about the family's situation for years but had chosen to remain silent. Local suppliers who delivered goods to the compound, postal workers who had seen the increasingly disturbing letters requesting medical supplies, and even some government officials who had received reports but failed to investigate, all bore some responsibility for allowing the situation to continue. The psychological evaluation of family members revealed trauma responses that challenged existing understanding of human adaptation to extreme circumstances. Many residents displayed what psychologists termed learned helplessness, so profound that they seemed incapable of imagining life outside the compound. Others had developed complex dissociative mechanisms that allowed them to function despite witnessing horrors that would have broken most people. Dr. Robert Chen, a specialist in cult psychology, noted that the family's belief system had evolved into something far more sophisticated than simple religious extremism. Over decades of isolation, they had developed an entire worldview that explained and justified their suffering while simultaneously preventing them from seeking help. This psychological prison was in many ways more effective than physical barriers at keeping the family isolated. The children presented the most immediate challenge for investigators. Those under 10 years of age had never seen the outside world and reacted to strangers with terror that bordered on catatonic shock. Many had never seen electric lights, motorized vehicles, or even basic medical equipment. The process of removing them from the compound required specialized teams trained in dealing with feral children and extreme trauma cases. The medical triage process revealed the full scope of the genetic catastrophe that had unfolded over 5 generations. Of the 43 residents, only 7 were classified as potentially capable of independent living with extensive support. 15 required immediate hospitalization for life-threatening conditions that had been left untreated for years. The remaining 21 needed specialized institutional care that would continue for the rest of their lives. Dr. Amanda Walsh, who coordinated the medical response, described the experience as fundamentally changing her understanding of human resilience and fragility. The fact that any family members had survived to adulthood was medically remarkable, yet their quality of life was so compromised that survival itself seemed like a form of prolonged suffering rather than a blessing. The forensic investigation of the compound revealed evidence of hundreds of unmarked graves scattered throughout the property. Ground-penetrating radar identified burial sites that dated back to the earliest days of the settlement, suggesting that the infant mortality rate had been catastrophically high from the very beginning. Many graves contained the remains of children who had survived only days or weeks before succumbing to conditions that modern medicine could have easily treated. The legal challenges posed by the case were unlike anything prosecutors had previously encountered. How do you charge someone with crimes when the perpetrators are themselves victims of generational abuse and genetic damage? Thomas Hartwell, the current leader, clearly bore responsibility for maintaining the system that had caused so much suffering, yet his own cognitive limitations raised questions about his ability to understand the consequences of his actions. District Attorney Margaret Foster ultimately decided to focus on rescue and rehabilitation rather than punishment. The priority became ensuring that surviving family members received appropriate care while preventing similar situations from occurring elsewhere. This approach acknowledged that the traditional justice system was poorly equipped to address crimes that spanned multiple generations and involved such complex psychological manipulation. The media coverage of the case sparked nationwide debate about government oversight of isolated communities and the balance between religious freedom and child protection. Civil liberties advocates argued that the investigation represented government overreach into private family matters, while child welfare experts pointed to the case as evidence that current monitoring systems were inadequate to protect vulnerable populations. The compound itself was eventually demolished and the land sold to the state, which designated it as a memorial site. A small plaque marks the location, serving as a reminder of what can happen when isolation, manipulation, and genetic inbreeding combine to create conditions of unimaginable suffering. The site draws researchers, genealogists, and medical students who study the case as an extreme example of human genetic limitations. The Hartwell family survivors scattered to various facilities and homes across the region, their futures uncertain, but at least free from the compound that had defined their existence for so long. Some adapted remarkably well to modern life, while others never fully recovered from the psychological and physical trauma of their upbringing. Their stories continue to inform research into genetic counseling, cult psychology, and the long-term effects of extreme isolation on human development. The case remains one of the most extensively documented examples of the consequences of prolonged inbreeding in human populations, providing crucial data for genetic research while serving as a sobering reminder of how quickly civilized society can deteriorate when cut off from outside influence and accountability. The story of the Hartwell family stands as perhaps the most extreme documented case of genetic isolation in modern American history, a nightmare that unfolded just miles away from hospitals, schools, and social services that could have prevented generations of suffering. What began with one man's twisted interpretation of religious purity became a living laboratory of human genetic limits, pushing the boundaries of survival itself until nature finally demanded intervention. Today, the survivors continue their journey of healing and adaptation, some finding remarkable resilience, while others remain forever marked by their origins. The medical data collected from their case continues to advance our understanding of human genetics, contributing to research that helps prevent similar tragedies worldwide. Their sacrifice, though involuntary, has illuminated the darkest corners of what happens when isolation meets fanaticism. The empty hollow where the compound once stood serves as more than just a memorial. It reminds us that evil often hides in plain sight, protected by distance and silence. How many other forgotten families exist in remote corners of our world, trapped by circumstances we can barely imagine? The answer should terrify us all. If this case has moved you to understand the importance of protecting the vulnerable and speaking up when something seems wrong, then these victims did not suffer in vain.